My name's Ethan Cole. I'm 45 years old, a data strategist based in Seattle, and for most of my adult life, I believed my family loved me quietly, just in a different way than they loved my older brother. I told myself that love didn't always have to look loud or lavish, but last spring, that belief broke. It didn't shatter with words or anger, but with the sound of a champagne cork popping in someone else's honor, my brother's, and the silence that followed on my end of the phone line. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. And if you enjoy stories like this one, real, raw, and a little too close to home, don't forget to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and gives me the motivation to share more stories that might just sound like yours too. It started the day Daniel, my brother, called to say he'd been promoted. I could hear the excitement in his voice, the way pride wrapped around his every word. I congratulated him. Of course I did. That's what brothers do. But not even an hour later, I got a text from my mom with a photo of a travel brochure. We're taking Daniel and Hannah to Santorini to celebrate. Isn't it wonderful? There was a string of heart emojis and a line that said, "He deserves it after all that hard work." There was no mention of me. No, you should come. No, let's make it a family trip. Just a glossy picture of blue roofs, white walls, and the bluest ocean I'd ever seen, sent to me as if I were a spectator to their joy. For the first time in years, I felt something sharp slip between the ribs of the role I'd been playing, the quiet, self-sufficient son, the one who never needed much. I stared at that text longer than I cared to admit, wondering when exactly I became the background of my own family. When they left for the trip, I watched their posts fill my feed. Sunset dinners, rooftop cocktails, my parents in matching linen, Daniel grinning with his arm around Hannah as if he'd conquered the world. The captions were always the same. So proud of our son. Our golden boy living his dream. I liked the first few photos, left a comment or two, even called before they boarded the flight to say, "You guys deserve this." And I meant it. At least I think I did. But somewhere between their first post and their last, a strange kind of quiet started building in me, a mix of pride, distance, and something unnamed. The night they returned, they hosted a little dinner at their house. I stopped by with a bottle of wine, something local from Walla Walla, because that's what I do. Show up, offer something, try to fit the part. The moment I walked in, my mom was showing someone photos from the trip on her tablet. Daniel's laugh carried across the room like music. Everyone was glowing from sun and salt water and good memories. I stood there smiling, listening, waiting for someone to ask me about my week, about work, about anything. But the conversation never bent in my direction. At some point, my dad patted me on the back and said, "You should have seen the sunsets there, Ethan. Out of this world." "I did," I said softly. "On Facebook." He laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. It's a strange thing, realizing that the people you love most can make you feel invisible without even meaning to. You tell yourself it's unintentional, that they're just distracted, that love doesn't always have to come with attention. You make excuses for them because acknowledging the truth that maybe they just don't see you feels unbearable. The next week, they gave Daniel a framed photo from the trip. The four of them on the deck of the ship, glasses raised high. When I noticed there was an empty chair in the background, something about it felt poetic. The chair wasn't meant for me, but it might as well have been. I remember going home that night and sitting in my car for a long time before going inside. I thought about all the times I'd been the one to help fix things quietly, picking up my mom from the airport when she forgot her ride, helping Dad file his taxes when he couldn't remember the software password, sending flowers for birthdays they forgot to remind each other about. It was always me, the reliable one, the easy one. And yet, when it came to joy, to celebration, to visible affection, I was invisible. I went back to work the next morning, pretending nothing had changed. But something had. I started noticing the pattern. The way my parents' eyes lit up when Daniel called, the way their voices softened when they said his name, the way their faces relaxed in pride when they talked about him to others. It wasn't jealousy that burned. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that cuts because it's so clear. There's a moment in every adult's life when you stop viewing your parents as infallible and start seeing them as people. That moment came for me over lukewarm coffee in my kitchen, scrolling through yet another photo of Daniel on a beach, my parents beside him, the caption reading, "Our hearts are full." Mine wasn't. Mine felt like it had been quietly edited out of the picture. People like to think family wounds come from big fights or betrayals, but most of the time, it's death by 1,000 small cuts. Missed calls, forgotten birthdays, the way someone else's success is celebrated while yours is treated like background noise. And the worst part? You start playing along. You convince yourself you don't mind. You tell yourself that being unnoticed means you're strong, self-sufficient, mature. But deep down, a question starts to form, whispering beneath every polite smile. What if they simply don't care enough to notice? That was the thought that sat with me that night as I stared out my apartment window at the rain streaking down the glass. A quiet storm outside, another inside. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of a shift. A slow unraveling of the illusion I'd held onto for decades. Because sometimes, it's not one big moment that breaks you. It's the moment you finally admit to yourself that you were already breaking long before anyone noticed. And this right here is where everything started to change. Now let me ask you something before we go on, because I'm curious about how you see it. If your family took your sibling on a luxury trip and didn't even think to invite you, would you? A. Laugh it off and tell yourself it's not a big deal? B. Feel hurt and start questioning your place in that family? Leave your answer, A or B, in the comments below. I really want to know what you do. 3 months after that trip, I received a promotion at work. It wasn't the kind that made headlines or drew champagne corks from the ceiling, but for me, it was something real. After 15 years in the same company, I had finally moved into a leadership role. My name appeared in the internal newsletter for the first time. Ethan Cole, Senior Analytics Lead. I'd been waiting to see those words for a long time. That morning, I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage a few minutes before walking inside, rereading the email from HR. My hands were shaking a little. I'd worked through countless late nights, picked up projects other people abandoned, mentored younger analysts who were promoted before me. I'd stayed loyal, consistent, professional. And now, for once, it had paid off. I drove straight to my parents' house that evening, a bottle of wine tucked under my arm, the same one that had sat unopened the night of Daniel's post-cruise dinner. I wanted to share good news, not for validation, but maybe for acknowledgement. I wanted them to look at me and say, "We see you too." When I walked in, the TV was on, some travel documentary about Greece still playing in the background, and my mom was scrolling through her phone. "Ethan, honey," she said, smiling warmly, "you didn't call first." "I wanted to surprise you," I said, and I told them about the promotion, how my team was expanding, how I'd be overseeing new projects, how I was finally managing people. It felt good to say it out loud, to make it real. My dad looked up, nodded approvingly. "That's great, son. Hard work pays off, huh?" My mom smiled. "That's wonderful, dear. Does this mean you have to wear suits now?" They chuckled softly, and then, just like a shift in weather, the conversation turned. My mom asked if I'd seen Daniel's latest post. His company had invited him to a financial summit in Chicago. "They're flying him business class," she said, her voice full of awe. "He'll be speaking on stage." I sat there, holding my glass, feeling the warmth of the wine fade from my throat. "That's great," I said quietly. For the next half hour, they discussed hotel bookings, Hannah's new boutique opening, and how Daniel had been featured on his company's website. My promotion, the reason I'd driven across town, the thing I was still trying to let sink in, became an afterthought, a pebble in the current of someone else's river. I tried to remind myself that it didn't matter, that pride doesn't always come with noise, that maybe they just expressed love differently. But as I sat there, I couldn't help but remember how they'd once filled the house with celebration for Daniel's milestones. Streamers for his first internship, champagne for his first raise, an entire cruise for his last promotion. For mine, a polite smile and a question about my dress code. That night when I got home, I set the wine bottle on my kitchen counter. I hadn't opened it at their house. It didn't feel right. I stared at it for a while before sliding it into the cabinet, still sealed, like a memory I didn't know what to do with. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into work. I wanted to believe that professional success could fill the space left by personal emptiness. I spent long hours with my new team trying to lead with empathy and care. I found meaning in seeing others grow. It was ironic, really. I spent my days lifting people up while wondering why the people I loved most couldn't do the same for me. One afternoon, a colleague, Maria, stopped by my office. "You've been killing it, Ethan. Management's already talking about the numbers from your department." She smiled. "Are your folks proud?" I hesitated before answering. "I think so," I said, forcing a smile. But the truth was, I hadn't heard from them since that dinner. Not a text, not a call, not a "how's the new job going?" Maria nodded, not noticing the pause. "You should celebrate," she said. "You earned it." That evening, I went home, made myself a proper dinner for once. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, a glass of the wine I'd meant to share. I lit a candle, not for romance or mood, but for acknowledgement, just a quiet act of presence. When I sat down at the table, I poured the wine and whispered, "Congratulations," to myself. It felt strange, almost embarrassing, but also necessary. Because if no one else was going to toast to my effort, I still could. I thought about calling my parents again, maybe inviting them over. But then I pictured how that conversation would go, their distracted smiles, the subtle pivot back to Daniel. I decided against it. The truth was, I didn't need another reminder of what I already knew. Still, there was a part of me that hoped they might reach out. That maybe they'd realize I was missing from the family texts, that I hadn't liked Daniel's last post, that maybe, just maybe, they'd notice. But the silence held. And in that silence, I started to hear something else. My own exhaustion. The kind that comes from constantly trying to be grateful for scraps of attention. That's the part of favoritism no one talks about. It's not just about the attention one child gets. It's about the emotional labor the other one does to stay gracious in the face of it. The years of pretending indifference, of swallowing small hurts, of smiling at the very moments that should have broken you. By the time the company newsletter featured me again, a short paragraph praising my team's performance, I didn't even think to share it with my parents. It wasn't anger anymore. It was understanding. They had their narrative, and I didn't fit into it. That realization should have made me sadder than it did. Instead, it made me steady. There's a strange strength that comes from no longer waiting for recognition. A few weeks later, Daniel called. His voice was cheerful, light. "Hey, Ethan, did Mom tell you? We're thinking of taking another trip next summer. Maybe Italy this time." I smiled into the phone. "That's great, Dan. You'll love it there." He talked for a few more minutes, filling me in on Hannah's boutique, on his plans, on life. When he finally asked, "How's work?" I almost laughed. It wasn't his fault. He meant it kindly. "It's good," I said simply. "Really good." After we hung up, I opened my email and reread the announcement from HR again. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember what pride felt like when it was mine alone. I poured another glass of that wine and raised it toward the window. Outside, Seattle's skyline shimmered in the distance, quiet and constant. That was the night I learned that sometimes the smallest celebrations, the quiet, private ones, mean more than the loudest applause, because they come from a place no one can take away from you. And maybe, I thought, that's what growing up really is. Learning to stop waiting for others to notice, and learning to be proud of yourself, even when no one's watching. My birthday fell on a Tuesday that year, one of those middle-of-the-week days that never feels like it belongs to anyone. I woke up early, made myself coffee, and tried not to expect anything. That's what adulthood does to you after a while. It trains your heart not to flinch at quiet mornings. Still, I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for something small. A message, a call, even one of those overused GIFs my mom liked to send. Nothing came. By noon, I decided to call them instead. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that maybe they were just busy. My dad answered on the second ring, cheerful as ever. "Ethan, I was just about to call you," he said, which I knew wasn't true, but I let him have it. "Happy birthday, son," he added quickly, and then, as if it were an afterthought, "Your mom and I are heading out of town for a few days." "Another trip?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Yeah, just a quick getaway," he said. "Same cruise line we took with Daniel. They gave us a loyalty discount for being returning customers." He laughed like it was a good deal, like that was what made it funny. I didn't say much, just wished them a safe trip. Before hanging up, my dad said, "We'll take you next time." But the way he said it made it sound like a polite lie, something meant to soften the truth neither of us wanted to say out loud. There would be no next time. Not for me. When the call ended, I stared at my reflection in the black screen of my phone. It was strange, how something as small as a missed dinner could echo louder than years of polite indifference. I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need cake or candles or a family dinner. But the lie didn't hold. That night, I ordered takeout from the little Chinese place down the street, the one Daniel and I used to love as kids, back when things were simpler. I set the food on my coffee table, dimmed the lights, and turned on some quiet jazz. It was my attempt at pretending I was okay with being alone. As I ate, I scrolled through social media, something I usually avoided. And there they were, my parents, smiling on the deck of a ship, wine glasses in hand. The caption read, "Back where we belong. The sea always feels like home." I froze. It wasn't the post itself that hurt. It was the timestamp. The photo had gone up an hour after our call. While I was deciding between dumplings or noodles, they were already sipping champagne, celebrating something, anything, but not me. I stared at that picture for a long time, studying the light, the way my mom's hair blew in the wind, the way my dad leaned against the railing like a man who'd earned his peace. I wondered if they even remembered what day it was. Maybe they did, and just didn't think it mattered. I didn't cry, though I felt something twist deep inside. It wasn't grief, exactly. It was clarity, the kind that burns quiet and steady, like a match that never quite goes out. After dinner, I found myself pulling out an old photo album from the bookshelf, the kind with fading edges and little plastic sleeves. Every birthday picture looked the same. Daniel in front of the cake, our parents smiling proudly behind him, and me, somewhere on the edge, half out of frame, clapping or holding the camera. Even in the snapshots where I was visible, I was never the focus, just part of the background noise. There was one photo that stuck out. I was maybe 10, standing beside Daniel as he opened a box of model airplanes. I remember that day vividly because I'd saved my allowance for months to buy him one of those planes. Our parents had praised me for being thoughtful, but I couldn't find that praise anywhere in their faces in the picture. They were all looking at him. I closed the album gently and sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of rain outside. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about birthdays or gifts or missed dinners. It was about placement, about where I existed in their story. I wasn't the son who needed celebrating. I was the one who kept everything running smoothly, the quiet background character who held the family together so the main plot could shine. I thought about calling Daniel, maybe joking about it. But what would I say? "Hey, our parents took another cruise on my birthday. Want to laugh about it?" No, that wasn't the kind of relationship we had anymore. He would feel guilty. I'd tell him it was fine, and nothing would change. Instead, I took my leftover food, packed it into the fridge, and decided to go for a walk. Seattle nights have a way of softening everything. The streetlights blurring into gold, the air smelling faintly of wet cedar. I walked for blocks, past couples in coats, past glowing apartment windows, each one a glimpse of a life that seemed more connected than mine. Somewhere between the corner cafe and the bookstore, I realized I was tired. Not physically, but emotionally tired of pretending. I'd spent years telling myself I didn't mind being left out, that independence was a virtue, that I was strong because I didn't need acknowledgement. But the truth was simpler and lonelier. I did need it. I just stopped expecting it because needing something you know you won't get eventually turns into shame. When I got home, I poured myself a drink and stood by the window. The cruise photo still lingered on my phone screen, but now it looked different. Smaller, almost distant. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. That was the moment something in me began to shift. I didn't know what it meant yet, only that I couldn't keep playing the same quiet role. I couldn't keep celebrating everyone else's victories while treating my own life like an afterthought. The world outside was still wet and glistening, city lights reflecting off puddles like tiny mirrors. For the first time, I saw my reflection clearly in the glass. Older, yes, but steadier. I made myself a promise that night, one I didn't say out loud but felt deeply. I would stop waiting to be included. Stop waiting for someone else to decide I mattered. It wasn't defiance, it was acceptance. And as I turned off the lights and let the apartment fall into darkness, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, not peace, but a small spark of self-recognition. The kind that whispers, "You see yourself now," and that's where it begins. That night, the silence didn't hurt as much. It sounded like space. Space I finally knew belonged to me. The invitation came through a family group text. A Sunday barbecue at the lake house in Oregon. It had been years since we'd used that place for anything meaningful. When I was younger, those weekends were loud and messy. Cousins running around, my dad at the grill pretending he knew how to cook steak, my mom setting the table with those same blue ceramic plates she called the good ones. But this time, the message felt less like an invitation and more like a reminder. We still exist, and you should show up. I hesitated for a few days before replying. Part of me didn't want to go. The other part, the one still trained to be polite, typed a simple, "I'll be there." When I arrived that afternoon, the air smelled like pine and charcoal, and the sound of laughter spilled from the back porch. Daniel was there with Hannah, of course, standing in the center of everything like he always did, his presence magnetic. My parents hovered near him, glowing with the pride that had become their default expression whenever he was around. "Ethan, you made it," my mom said, her voice cheerful and practiced. She gave me a quick half hug, the kind that doesn't quite land, and then turned back to arranging food on the picnic table. My dad clapped me on the shoulder, smiled briefly, and went back to telling a story I wasn't part of. I offered to help with the setup. Old habits die hard. Before I knew it, I was carrying trays from the kitchen, refilling drinks, adjusting chairs. Everyone was busy talking about Daniel's new speaking engagement. He'd been invited to a leadership summit in Chicago, and the room practically pulsed with pride as they discussed it. My mom beamed. "They said he's going to be one of the youngest keynote speakers they've ever had," she said. I smiled, nodding. "That's great," I said. "No one asked how my work was going. Not once." At one point, Hannah turned to me and said, "You must be so proud of him." I nodded again. I'd learned that yes was easier than explaining the 1,000 ways pride can coexist with pain. The conversation drifted from his career to their upcoming vacation, then to the boutique Hannah had just opened. My mom was already planning to post about it on Facebook. Every time Daniel spoke, the group leaned in. Every time I did, the topic slid away, like the current pulling from beneath your feet. When the food was ready, my mom called out, "Ethan, can you take a picture of us before we eat?" Of course I could. That was my role, always behind the lens, never in the frame. I positioned them in front of the lake, the afternoon sun falling just right, and said, "Smile." They did. My mom laughed, Daniel wrapped his arm around Hannah, my dad leaned in, they looked happy, complete. As I lowered the phone, my mom reached for it. "Perfect," she said, scrolling through the photos. She didn't ask me to take another one with me in it. No one did. It hit harder than I expected, that small omission. Maybe because it wasn't new. Maybe because it was so familiar it almost felt like a tradition. I handed her the phone and stepped inside, pretending I needed to check a message. The hallway was cooler, quieter. From there, I could still hear their laughter outside, distant but clear. I stood for a while, my back against the wall, listening to the rhythm of their voices. They started talking about Christmas plans. Daniel and Hannah were planning a trip abroad, a gift to themselves, my mom said proudly. My dad offered to help cover the flights. There was laughter, a toast, the clinking of glasses. No one mentioned what I'd be doing for Christmas. No one asked. It's strange how a room can hold so much noise and still make you feel invisible. I wandered into the kitchen, poured myself another drink, and leaned against the counter. Through the window, I could see the reflection of the group. My mom had posted the photo already. "Family time at the lake." And within minutes, the likes and comments started rolling in. "Beautiful family. So much love here." I stared at those words, knowing how far they were from the truth. I finished my drink and thought about leaving, but something inside me told me to stay. Not out of hope, but out of confirmation. I needed to see it fully, to stop pretending I didn't know what was happening. When dessert came out, I carried plates and napkins. No one noticed. I refilled drinks, cleaned up wrappers, made sure the garbage bag didn't overflow. Still invisible. At some point, Daniel made a toast. To family, he said, raising his glass. To all the things that make us who we are. Everyone echoed the cheer. I raised my glass too, even though I wasn't sure what part I played in that definition anymore. After a while, people started drifting indoors. My dad turned on the game. My mom brought out coffee. I sat outside on the steps, watching the lake. The water caught the fading light in ripples, soft and gold. For a long time, that house had been my place of belonging. But in that moment, it felt like someone else's home. I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel stepped out holding a beer. "You okay out here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just getting some air." He nodded. "Good crowd today, huh?" "Yeah," I said again. There was a pause, and then he smiled. "I'm glad you came. It means a lot to Mom and Dad." It should have comforted me, but it didn't. What he meant was, they like it when things look fine. He went back inside after that, and I sat there until the noise turned to murmurs, then quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, just hollow. When I finally stood to leave, I slipped through the side door unnoticed. My mom's voice carried faintly from inside, something about next week's brunch, something about Daniel's flight schedule. Nothing about me. The drive back to Seattle was long and silent. The sky had turned that deep indigo blue that makes everything look sharper. I thought about the photo on her phone, the one I took, the one where everyone looked happy, complete, framed perfectly. It struck me how fitting that was. My role had always been to make the picture look good, even if I was never in it. That night, I scrolled through their post again, dozens of comments, heart emojis, such a wonderful family. And in a way, they were right. It was a wonderful family, just not one I belonged to anymore. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me clear, because standing outside the frame that day, I finally saw the whole picture. And for the first time, I knew I didn't want to fight for a space in it anymore. Winter came early that year, sharp and gray, the kind of cold that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. After that barbecue, I didn't visit my parents for a while. I didn't make an announcement about it or send a dramatic message. I simply stopped showing up. The silence started small. First, I ignored the group chat. Then I stopped responding to photos my mom sent of Daniel's new house or the holiday decorations she was proud of. Eventually, the messages came less often, and when they did, they carried that vague politeness that only appears when people realize something has changed but can't admit why. Christmas was the first true test. Every year, it was the same routine. A dinner at their house, too much food, laughter that never seemed to include me, and gifts wrapped with more thought for show than for meaning. That December, I made a decision. I wasn't going. I didn't send regrets. I didn't make excuses about work. I just let the date arrive and pass like any other day. On Christmas morning, my phone buzzed once. A message from my mom. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart. We miss you today." For a second, my thumb hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to write something, to bridge the gap, to pretend that missing me and understanding me were the same thing. Instead, I locked the screen. I spent that day volunteering at a community kitchen downtown, serving food to people who thanked me like my presence mattered. It was quiet work, humbling, grounding. When I walked home that night under the pale streetlights, I realized I didn't feel lonely. I felt weightless. Like the part of me that had spent years begging to be seen had finally learned to breathe without permission. 3 days later, my mom called. I almost didn't answer, but habit won. Her voice was gentle, uncertain. "We were surprised not to see you," she said. "Your dad kept saying you'd probably walk through the door any minute." "I needed some time," I replied. "Work's been busy." "You could have said something," she said softly. "We didn't think you'd care that much." That sentence hung in the air, heavy and final. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. They truly didn't think I cared. And why would they? I'd spent decades being the easy one, the quiet one, the son who never made demands, never cried too loudly, never took up too much space. I trained them not to see me. "I do care," I said finally, "but maybe not in the way I used to." I could hear her exhale on the other end, a small sigh that sounded like confusion, maybe disappointment. I didn't feel the silence. Neither did she. We said goodbye, and I knew something fundamental had shifted. After that call, I started therapy. Not because I was broken, but because I was tired of pretending I wasn't. My therapist, a woman named Lara with calm eyes and a voice that sounded like rain, asked me during our first session, "When was the last time you felt truly seen?" I thought about it for a long time and then realized I couldn't remember. Maybe when I was a kid, building model planes with my dad before Daniel's shadow stretched across everything. Or maybe never. The thought hurt, but it also felt like truth. Lara taught me that silence can be two things, a wound or a boundary. It depends on what you use it for. For years, my silence had been about suppression, swallowing hurt so it wouldn't spill over. But now, it became something different. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending my decisions to people who had already decided what version of me they wanted to believe in. I started going on hikes on weekends, long walks through the trails near Mount Rainier, where the air smelled like pine and distance. I joined a mentorship program, teaching high school kids about data analytics and storytelling through numbers. They were curious and hungry to learn, and in their energy, I found pieces of myself I'd forgotten existed. The less I engaged with my family, the more peace I found in the quiet. It wasn't rebellion, it was recalibration. When you've been unheard for so long, stillness starts to sound like freedom. Spring crept in slowly, and I noticed I was smiling more. Work was going well, my team had grown, and for the first time in my career, people were looking to me for guidance, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That kind of trust felt cleaner than approval. Then, one Sunday afternoon, my dad called. It was unusual. He rarely called without my mom prompting him. His tone was light, careful. "We haven't seen much of you lately," he said. "Your mom's been worried." "I've just been keeping to myself," I said. "Well," he replied after a pause, "you know, she takes it personally when you don't show up." I almost laughed. "Does she?" I asked quietly, because for years I showed up and it never seemed to make a difference. He didn't know what to say to that. The silence stretched so long that I thought the line had dropped. Eventually, he said, "Families go through phases, Ethan. Don't make this one permanent." "I'm not making anything permanent," I said. "I'm just making it honest." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment staring out at the city. The skyline glowed faintly against the dusk. For the first time, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was done trying to translate myself into a language they'd never learned to speak. In therapy, Lara once said, "Sometimes peace doesn't come after confrontation. Sometimes it comes after you stop performing." That stuck with me. My whole life had been a quiet performance, being agreeable, being proud from the sidelines, pretending that crumbs of attention were a feast. But now, I'd stopped acting. That silence, once heavy and suffocating, began to feel like a space I could build inside. I filled it with music, with late-night writing, with the laughter of the kids I mentored. I started to recognize the sound of my own thoughts again. By the time summer came around, the calls had slowed even more. The group chat was mostly photos of Daniel and Hannah, vacations, work events, family brunches I wasn't invited to. I didn't mind. Each time I didn't reply, each time I chose quiet over explanation, I felt a little more like myself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and realized something simple but powerful. Silence used to be what they gave me. Now, it was what I chose. And that choice, for the first time, felt like control. The following year unfolded quietly, but not in the lonely way it used to. My days were full. Meetings, projects, mentoring sessions, and the steady hum of purpose. For the first time, I wasn't chasing approval. I was simply living. The absence of my family's attention no longer felt like a wound. It felt like open air. Work was thriving. The analytics department had doubled in size, and I found myself leading not just a team but a culture. I was building something lasting, something that didn't depend on anyone's validation but my own. There was a kind of serenity in that, the peace of knowing that what you've built can stand on its own, even when no one claps for you. When the email came one Friday morning, I almost missed it. The subject line read, "Nomination, National Leadership in Data and Technology Awards." I opened it, expecting some generic corporate blast, but instead I saw my name listed among the nominees. Ethan Cole, Strategic Innovation in Analytics. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, waiting for it to feel real. I didn't jump up or cheer. I just sat there, hands folded, feeling a quiet kind of pride fill the room. It wasn't the loud, performative kind that comes with applause. It was the stillness of recognition. The kind that tells you, this is what happens when you stop performing for others and start showing up for yourself. My coworkers found out the following week. Someone must have seen the nomination list and printed it, because when I walked into the office kitchen Monday morning, there were streamers taped to the cabinets and a sign that said, "Congratulations, Ethan." There was even a cake, one of those supermarket ones with too much frosting, and someone had scrawled, "All earned, all you" in blue icing. I laughed for real that day. The sound surprised me. It had been a long time since joy came so easily. My team clapped. There were photos, and for a few moments, I felt something close to belonging. It wasn't familial love, but it was genuine care. It was community, and it was enough. That night, I went home to my apartment and stood by the window, watching the city lights shimmer below. I thought about calling my parents to tell them the news, but the thought evaporated almost instantly. I knew how that conversation would go. My mom's distracted, "That's nice, dear," followed by a quick pivot to Daniel's latest achievement. So instead, I poured myself a drink, sat down on the couch, and let the quiet be my witness. Weeks later, the nomination was announced publicly. I posted one photo online, just the plaque with my name engraved. No caption. I didn't need one. The comments poured in anyway. Former colleagues, mentors, old university friends, even a few distant relatives. "Proud of you. Well deserved. Knew you'd make it." But not my parents. Not Daniel. Not a word. For a moment, the silence hit harder than I wanted to admit. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd long stopped needing their recognition. But there's still a small part of you, no matter how grown, that aches to hear your parents say, "We're proud." That ache lingered, but it didn't break me. Instead, I let it sharpen the truth I'd been building my life on. Not all families are made of people who understand how to love out loud. Some are built through presence, through action, through quiet consistency. And I had started finding those kinds of people elsewhere. My mentorship program had become one of the best parts of my life. Every Thursday, I met with a group of teenagers interested in tech and data storytelling. They reminded me of a younger version of myself, curious, uncertain, waiting for someone to tell them they were capable. I didn't realize how much I needed that space until I started showing up for it. One of the students, a bright kid named Marcus, once told me, "You're the first adult who actually listens." That sentence stayed with me longer than any award could. Around the same time, I decided to move. My apartment in Seattle had started to feel like a waiting room for a life I was no longer living. I wanted sunlight, space, something new. When I found a condo in Denver, a small, modern place with wide windows and a view of the Rockies, I knew it was mine. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine in a way nothing had ever been before. Moving felt like a reset, a quiet act of self-definition. I filled the space with things that made me feel grounded. Shelves of books, plants that thrived in the light, framed prints of places I wanted to visit. I even bought a record player, something I'd always wanted but never felt I could justify. There was something about hearing the soft crackle before a song started that made the world feel less rushed. When the boxes were unpacked, I decided to host a housewarming party. Not a big one, just a few friends from work, some neighbors, and the mentors from my program. We ordered food, played music, laughed until midnight. I didn't invite my parents or Daniel. Not out of bitterness, but because I didn't want to perform anymore. I didn't want to stand in a room where I'd be measured against someone else. At one point during the evening, as I looked around at the people talking and smiling, I realized something simple but profound. This was family too. Not by blood, but by choice. People who showed up, who saw me, who cared not about my resume but about my presence. After everyone left, I stood on the balcony with a glass of wine. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and city smoke. For years, I'd believed that peace would come when my parents finally recognized me. But peace, it turned out, was what came when I stopped waiting for them to. A week later, I received a message from an old family friend on LinkedIn. It read, "Heard about your nomination, Ethan. Congratulations. Your parents must be so proud." I stared at the words for a long time, then smiled faintly. "Thank you," I wrote back. It wasn't worth explaining, because they weren't proud. Not because they didn't know, but because they didn't want to look in my direction long enough to notice. And for the first time, that realization didn't make me angry. It made me free. The next morning, I woke early, opened the curtains, and watched the sun stretch across the mountains. The light filled the room in a way that felt like promise. My life was mine now, quiet, self-built, unapproved, but deeply real. There's a strange kind of joy that comes when you stop asking to be seen and simply start existing without apology. I wasn't chasing applause anymore. I was building something lasting, one day at a time, and letting the silence that once hurt me become the foundation for peace. And as I stood there, coffee in hand, I realized something I never thought I'd feel: contentment. Not the loud, cinematic kind, just the steady hum of a life that finally belonged to me. It had been 6 months since Daniel's wedding when his message appeared on my phone. It was late on a Thursday night, and I was still awake, sitting by the window of my condo, the Denver skyline glowing faintly beneath the stars. The text was short, uncharacteristically so. "Hey, Ethan, you free for coffee sometime?" I stared at it for a long minute. Daniel was never vague. He planned everything: calls, dinners, vacations, down to the minute. For him to send a message like that, stripped of context or small talk, meant something had shifted. I typed and deleted a dozen replies before settling on 2 words: "Sure, when?" We agreed to meet in Portland, a neutral ground halfway between where he and our parents lived and where I'd built my new life. I hadn't seen him since before the wedding, and even then, our last conversation had been little more than polite sentences dressed in brotherly tone. But this felt different, heavier. When I walked into the cafe that Tuesday afternoon, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked polished, as always, clean-cut hair, tailored jacket, but there was something frayed at the edges, a kind of exhaustion he couldn't iron out. He stood when he saw me, a hesitant smile pulling at his mouth. "Hey, man," he said. "Hey." We ordered coffee and sat across from each other, the silence stretching between us like a fragile bridge. "You didn't come to the wedding," he said after a while. There was no accusation in his voice, just observation. "No," I said. "I didn't." He nodded slowly, staring into his cup. "I wasn't surprised," he admitted, "but I guess I hoped you would. Why?" He exhaled, the sound heavy. "Because I thought that's what you'd always do, show up." That word, show up, cut deeper than I expected. It was the story of my life with them. I showed up to every celebration, every crisis, every obligation, even when no one noticed, even when I wasn't invited into the picture. "Yeah," I said quietly. "That's kind of the problem." He looked up, eyes uncertain. "What do you mean?" "I showed up because none of you thought you needed to ask, because it was easier to assume I'd be there than to make room for me." Daniel's fingers tightened around his cup. "We never meant to make you feel left out." "I know," I said. "That's what makes it harder. You didn't mean to, but you still did. You just never noticed." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think I didn't want to notice. I like being the favorite. It felt good to be the one they looked at that way. I just didn't realize what it was costing you." His honesty caught me off guard. There was no defense in his tone, just truth. He wasn't trying to justify it. He was trying to understand it. "What it cost me," I said, "wasn't what you think. It wasn't about money or vacations or applause. It was about silence. It was standing in a room full of people who were supposed to know me and realizing they didn't. It was watching you all celebrate each other while I sat there invisible." He nodded slowly, jaw tightening. "You're right," he said finally. "We left you behind, and we acted like you were the one who walked away." That sentence landed like a confession. I hadn't expected it. Not from him, not from anyone in my family. I looked at him for a long time. "You know," I said, "I spent years thinking if I worked hard enough, if I became successful enough, someone would finally say it. 'We're proud of you, Ethan.' But that never came. And now I think it's better that way," he frowned. "Better? Because I don't need it anymore," I said. "Their silence taught me something, that approval isn't love. It's control, and I'm done mistaking one for the other." Daniel leaned back, rubbing his hands together. "I think I used to envy you," he said quietly. I blinked. "Me?" He nodded. "You always seemed steady, untouchable, like you didn't need anyone's permission to exist. I didn't realize that calm came from being so used to disappointment." That was the closest thing to understanding anyone in my family had ever offered me. For the first time, I saw him not as the golden child, but as someone who'd been shaped by the same parents in a different way, fed attention instead of starved of it, and in the process, dependent on it. I didn't stop coming around because I hated you, I said. I stopped because I couldn't keep playing the role you all wrote for me, the reliable one, the silent one. He nodded. I get it now. I think I like that version of you because it made everything easier, but I see it was killing something in you. We sat there in that little cafe for over an hour, trading truths we'd avoided for a lifetime. The words weren't angry, just real. Every sentence felt like dusting off old wounds that had been hidden under politeness for too long. At one point, Daniel said, "Do you think you'll ever come back? To family stuff, I mean." I looked out the window. The rain had started, thin and steady, tracing lines down the glass. "Maybe," I said, "but not as the same person, not as someone waiting to be let in." He nodded, accepting it. "That's fair." When we finally stood to leave, there was no dramatic goodbye. Just a quiet understanding. He extended his hand, then hesitated and pulled me into a hug instead. It was brief but real, two adults trying to unlearn decades of distance. As we walked out, he said, "Thanks for meeting me." "Thanks for asking," I replied. That night, back at my condo, I found a message from him waiting on my phone. "I hope this isn't the last time we talk like that." I typed back, "That's up to both of us." He responded with a simple, "I'll try." And for the first time in years, I believed him. There was no miracle reconciliation that night, no sudden warmth spreading through the family group chat, no apology from our parents. But something far more important had happened. A bridge, fragile but real, had been built between two brothers who'd spent most of their lives standing on opposite shores. As I turned off the lights and watched the city sink into darkness, I realized that bridges don't have to be perfect to matter. Sometimes it's enough that someone finally looks across the distance and says, "I see you." For the first time, Daniel had. And maybe that was where healing began. Not in fixing the past, but in finally telling the truth about it. Spring came quietly that year, without the usual rush of plans or expectations. I had stopped marking holidays on my calendar, stopped trying to predict when the next family gathering would pull me back into the same old rhythm. Life had grown simpler, steadier. I spent my weekends hiking the trails near Boulder or wandering the small bookstores downtown, sometimes ending the day with a glass of wine on my balcony, the Rockies catching the last of the evening light. It was a solitude I'd chosen, and for once it didn't feel like punishment. Then one evening, a message from Daniel appeared on my phone. "Thinking of hosting a casual dinner next weekend," it read. "Just a few people, no pressure. Come if you want." I stared at it for a while. There was no guilt in the words, no expectation, no apology, just an opening. For years, family invitations had come wrapped in obligation, with the weight of performance attached. This one felt different, gentle, almost like an olive branch extended in silence. I almost ignored it, not out of bitterness, but because I didn't know what showing up would mean anymore. Would it feel like stepping back into a room that had already forgotten me? Would my presence be a disruption, or would it finally be acknowledged for what it was? A choice? But something in me, the same part that had always longed for honesty more than closeness, told me to go. So that Saturday, I got in my car and drove the 4 hours to Portland. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain as I pulled up to Daniel's house. When he opened the door, he smiled, not the polished, photo-ready grin he used to wear, but a quieter one. "You made it," he said simply. Inside, the place was warm and lived in. The walls were lined with framed photos, some from the wedding, some from trips with friends, and a few new ones I hadn't seen before. The table was already set, a mix of mismatched plates and candles burning low. There were maybe 7 or 8 people there. Our cousin Layla, Aunt Jill, a few friends of Daniel's. It wasn't a grand event, just dinner, laughter, and a playlist humming softly in the background. I stood there for a second, taking it all in, when Layla waved from across the table. "Hey, Ethan, we saved you a seat." She pointed to a chair at the table, one placed deliberately between her and Daniel. Not at the far end, not squeezed in as an afterthought, but right in the middle. That simple gesture hit harder than I expected. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was acknowledgement. For the first time in years, there was a chair meant for me. Dinner unfolded gently. People talked about work, about small things, recipes, movies, travel plans. It was easy, almost disarmingly normal. When conversation turned to Daniel's recent projects, I braced myself for the familiar shift, that old spotlight that always left me in the shadows. But this time, when Daniel finished describing a new business partnership, he turned to me and said, "Ethan's been working on some fascinating projects too. Tell them about the mentorship program." It wasn't performative. He said it like a brother proud to share space. So I did. I told them about the students, the data challenges, the look on one kid's face when he got his first scholarship offer. The table listened, and when I finished, Layla smiled. "That's incredible," she said. "Those kids are lucky to have you." I didn't know how to respond. Compliments about my work usually came through screens or annual reports, not at a dinner table. It felt strange and fragile and real. Later, while people cleaned up, Daniel and I found ourselves on the porch. The air was cool again, the sky washed in that soft pink of a fading sunset. "I didn't tell Mom you were coming," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" She would have tried to control it, or worry, or make it a thing. I didn't want that. I wanted it to just be what it was. I nodded. "She'll find out eventually." He half smiled. "Yeah, and she'll probably have feelings about it, but that's her business, not yours." There was a pause, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then he added, "She still gives me grief for talking to you, you know. Says I'm trying to stir things up." "You are," I said softly, "but in a good way." He laughed, that same boyish sound I'd grown up hearing. For the first time in decades, it didn't sting. When I got up to leave later that night, he walked me to the door. "Next time," he said, "you're bringing dessert." "Only if I get to pick the playlist," I replied. We both smiled, and it felt like the first time we'd ever spoken as equals, not as the golden child and the forgotten one, but as two men who finally understood the cost of pretending. Driving home, the road stretched out beneath the moonlight, the air calm and still. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated or healed. I just felt grounded, like I'd finally stopped orbiting the gravitational pull of a family system that never made room for me and had instead found my own center. My parents still hadn't called. I doubted they would. I knew they were still posting photos with Daniel, still pretending distance was coincidence, but it didn't sting anymore. Their silence wasn't a wound. It was confirmation that I'd stopped waiting for what they couldn't give. When I got home, I placed my keys on the counter and glanced at the framed nomination plaque hanging near the door. For years, I'd kept it there as proof of my worth, a reminder that I mattered. Now, it just blended into the space, quiet, present, no longer something I needed to look at every morning. I poured myself a glass of water, stepped out onto the balcony, and let the cool night air wash over me. I thought about the dinner, about that simple wooden chair with my name in it. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was something quieter, a small act of recognition that maybe, just maybe, things could start to exist without apology. People often talk about healing like it's a clean break, a moment of clarity where everything hurts less. But what I've learned is that real healing is quieter. It's the moment you stop rehearsing old pain and start living without waiting for a reaction. As I stood there watching the city lights flicker, I realized that life rarely gives us the applause we imagine. Sometimes it gives us something softer. A chair pulled out for you, a brother trying to meet you halfway, the steady peace of no longer needing permission to exist. And sometimes, that's more than enough. When I look back at Ethan Cole's story, what stands out is not the pain of being overlooked, but the strength it took for him to stop chasing recognition from those who never intended to give it. His journey began in the shadow of a brother's spotlight, where every success was met with silence, and every milestone felt invisible. But instead of collapsing under that neglect, Ethan chose something far more powerful: self-definition. He built a life that was his own, a career earned through quiet perseverance, friendships rooted in mutual respect, and a peace that came not from being celebrated, but from being free. His reunion with Daniel wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about acknowledging the truth and realizing that closure doesn't always come from apologies. It comes from acceptance. The lesson in Ethan's story runs deep. Your worth is not measured by who notices you, but by how you choose to see yourself. Sometimes, walking away from the places that never saw your value is the only way to make room for the people who will. You don't need permission to exist fully, to love yourself loudly, or to build a life that fits the size of your dreams. The moment you stop asking for acknowledgement is the moment you begin to live authentically. So here's a question for you. If you were in Ethan's shoes, would you A, try to reconcile and keep reaching out to your family? B, choose peace and build a new life without seeking their approval? Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell me why. I'd love to hear how you see it. Do you believe family bonds are worth mending at any cost? Or are there times when letting go is the real act of love? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can all learn from each other. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and gives me the motivation to bring you more heartfelt stories like this one.